The scratch marks on Martin Fisher's cabin door were deep enough to catch his fingernail. He stood there in the pre-dawn cold, his breath forming clouds in the February air, running his hand along the shredded wood. 3 vertical gouges, each one carved through the protective varnish down to bare timber. Whatever had done this had spent hours here. Hours! Martin's jaw tightened. 40 years he'd maintained this cabin in the Ötztal sector of the Austrian Alps, and now some desperate animal had turned his door into kindling. He'd dealt with bears testing his storage shed, lynx prowling too close to the perimeter, even an aggressive stag during rutting season that had demolished his woodpile. But this felt different. The gouges were too deliberate, too focused, too persistent. He grabbed his rifle from inside, not to shoot, just protocol and his tracking kit. The sun wasn't up yet, but the snow held enough ambient light to see by. Fresh powder had fallen overnight, maybe 5 centimeters, which meant the tracks would be pristine. Martin knelt beside the deepest prints just beyond his threshold. Wolf. Large male, probably 4 or 5 years old, based on the pad size and stride length. He'd tracked enough of them to know, but the pattern made his chest constrict. The wolf had come to his door, left, returned, left again, returned again. Martin stood and followed the tracks in a wide circle around his cabin, counting. 16 approaches. 16 times this animal had come to his door, scratched at the wood, then retreated into the tree line as if gathering courage to try again. The snow told the whole story. Hesitation, marks where the wolf had stopped and paced, deeper impressions where it had reared up on hind legs to reach higher on the door, drag marks from its claws as it scraped downward. What kind of wolf does that? In his 34 years managing these mountains, Martin had never seen behavior like this. Wolves were ghosts. You saw their kills, their scat, their territory markers, but rarely the animals themselves. They avoided human structures with an almost superstitious caution. It was genetic wisdom. Humans meant danger, humans meant death. Every wolf that got too comfortable around people didn't live long enough to pass on that mistake. This one had wanted something, needed something desperately enough to override every instinct telling it to run. Martin's hands were cold. He'd come outside in just his thermal shirt and vest, no proper jacket. His breath came faster now, not from cold, but from something he couldn't name, a feeling he didn't like. The scratching must have gone on for hours while he slept, and he'd heard nothing. Nothing. The cabin walls were thick, yes, but not that thick. Then he remembered. He'd taken his sleep medication last night because his shoulder had been aching from hauling timber. The prescription stuff, the kind that knocked him out, so completely his wife used to joke she could run a vacuum cleaner next to his head if he'd woken up, if he'd opened that door when the wolf needed him to. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. Now the wolf was gone, and Martin was left with a destroyed door and questions that felt too big for the morning silence. He should radio this in, document it properly, file a report with the district office, standard protocol for unusual wildlife behavior. But something stopped him. His hand went to the radio on his belt, then dropped away. The tracks led west toward the frozen lake. Gletschersee, the old-timers called it. 6 kilometers through difficult terrain, most of it uphill through dense forest. The wolf had traveled that distance, scratched at his door all night with increasing desperation, and then traveled back when dawn came and Martin still hadn't answered. Why? What could drive a wild animal to such behavior? Martin made his decision in the span of 3 heartbeats. He went back inside, loaded his pack with emergency supplies, first aid kit, flares, radio, extra rope, his satellite phone, energy bars, A thermal blanket. The tracks were fresh, less than 2 hours old based on how the snow had settled in them and the lack of wind disturbance. He could follow them. He should follow them. Whatever had driven a wolf to his door in the middle of the night, whatever had made it desperate enough to approach human territory 16 separate times, that was something he needed to understand. He locked the cabin and started walking. The snow crunched under his boots with a sound like breaking glass, and the forest was silent except for his breathing and the distant call of a raven. Martin was not a sentimental man. He didn't romanticize wildlife the way some of the younger foresters did, the ones fresh from university with their theories about animal consciousness and emotional intelligence. Animals operated on instinct, hunger, territory, reproduction, survival. They weren't moral agents. They didn't make choices the way humans did, but these tracks told a different story. 200 meters from his cabin, he found where the wolf had stopped and circled. The snow was packed down in a tight radius. The animal had waited here, pacing, testing its resolve. Then it had moved toward the cabin again. Martin could read the hesitation in the gait, front paws planted, weight shifted back, then forward again. A pattern he'd seen in young wolves, learning to approach a kill, guarded by more dominant pack members. The wolf had been afraid, terrified even, but it came anyway. The forest swallowed Martin whole. Ancient spruce trees pressed close on both sides of the wolf's trail, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't been disturbed by wind. His boots broke through the crust with each step, and within 20 minutes his calves were burning from the effort of lifting his feet clear each time. But the wolf's tracks remained crisp, easy to follow, a single line of purpose cutting through the wilderness. Martin checked his watch. 6:15. The sun still hadn't crested the peaks and wouldn't for another hour. He'd told his wife he'd be home by noon. She was used to him leaving early for patrols, but she'd worry if he was late. He should call her? He pulled out his satellite phone, then hesitated. What would he say? That he was following a wolf because it had scratched his door? That something in those tracks made his heart beat faster? She'd think he'd lost his mind. He put the phone away. The tracks led upward through a steep section where Martin had to grab exposed roots to haul himself forward. His shoulder screamed in protest, the same shoulder that had kept him awake last night. 63 years old, and his body was finally making him pay for decades of hard mountain work. But the wolf had climbed this same slope in the dark, in a snowstorm, driven by something Martin didn't yet understand. At the top of the rise, the tracks changed. Martin stopped, breathing hard. Here, the wolf had broken into a run. The gait lengthened, the prints deeper, as it pushed off with its hind legs, running towards something or away from something. Martin's hand went to his rifle, checking the safety out of habit. His eyes scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, just snow and silence and the endless cathedral of spruce. He kept walking, faster now. His breath came in white bursts. The wolf's panic was written in the snow, and Martin felt it transfer into his own chest like an infection. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong all night while he slept through the scratching. The forest opened suddenly into a clearing, and Martin saw Gletscher spread out before him. The lake was a white expanse, frozen solid since November. He'd walked across it dozens of times during winter patrols. The ice was thick enough to support a truck. But from this vantage point, 300 meters above the lake, he could see something dark on the surface. His stomach dropped. Martin pulled out his binoculars, hands shaking from exertion, and something else. He focused on the dark shape, a hole in the ice. Recent, the edges were still sharp, not rounded by freeze-thaw cycles, and next to it, his breath caught, a body, human, lying motionless on the ice. "Scheiße!" Martin whispered. His fingers fumbled for his radio. "This is Fischer, Ötztal sector. I have a situation at Gletschersee. Possible drowning victim. I need emergency response now." His voice was steady despite the hammering in his chest, 40 years of training taking over. The response crackled back immediately. "Copy, Fischer. Help is en route. Your location?" "Northwest shore above the lake. I'm going down." He didn't wait for their reply. The wolf tracks led straight down the slope toward the ice, and Martin followed them, half running, half sliding through the deep snow. Branches whipped at his face, his rifle banged against his back. None of it mattered. Someone had fallen through the ice. The wolf had known. The wolf had tried to tell him. It took him 8 minutes to reach the shore, 8 minutes that felt like hours. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, but he didn't stop. When his boots finally hit the lake ice, Martin slowed. Ice was treacherous after a thaw freeze cycle. He tested each step, distributing his weight carefully, even though every instinct screamed at him to run. The body was a woman. Young, maybe 30. Tourist clothes, the kind of expensive ski jacket that people wore when they didn't actually know the mountains. She was on her back, one arm outstretched toward the hole in the ice. Martin's throat tightened. She'd tried to climb out. She'd almost made it. But she hadn't. He knelt beside her, pulled off his glove, pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Nothing. Her skin was ice cold, lips blue. He'd seen enough death in these mountains to recognize it. She'd been gone for hours, probably fell through last night during the storm. And then Martin saw the marks in the ice. Claw marks, deep gouges in the ice, radiating out from the hole in 4 distinct patterns. Martin's mind went blank for 3 seconds, then snapped into focus with terrible clarity. He moved around the hole, examining each set of marks. They were methodical, deliberate. Something had braced itself here, dug in and pulled. The woman's jacket was torn at the shoulders, not ripped, torn in a specific pattern. Puncture marks, canine teeth. Martin rocked back on his heels, his breath coming faster. The wolf had found her, had tried to pull her out. The evidence was everywhere once he knew to look for it. The drag marks where something had gripped her jacket, the places where the ice had cracked under the strain, the way her body was positioned. Not as she would have fallen, but as someone had tried to move her. 2 wolves, he corrected himself, studying the tracks more carefully. 2 different sets of prints, 2 different sizes. They'd worked together. For how long? Hours, probably. All through the night while the storm raged. They'd tried to save her, and failed. Martin's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs, trying to understand what he was seeing. Wolves didn't do this. Wolves were opportunistic carnivores. If they found a body, they scavenged it. They didn't attempt rescue. That wasn't in their behavioral repertoire. 40 years of wildlife management, of tracking and observing and documenting, and he'd never seen anything like this. The radio crackled. "Fischer, ETA 20 minutes. Do you have visual on the victim?" "Confirmed," Martin managed. "Female, approximately 30 years old. Deceased." His voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow, distant. "Copy. Stay with the body. Don't move anything." Martin stood slowly, his knees protesting. He needed to secure the area, take photographs, document everything, but his eyes kept returning to those claw marks in the ice. The wolves had tried so hard. The grooves were deep enough that they must have torn their pads open on the rough ice. They'd injured themselves trying to pull her out. When they failed, one of them ran 6 kilometers to get help. To get him. Martin's throat closed. He turned away from the body, scanning the shoreline. Where was the wolf now, watching? The tracks led away from the lake, back into the forest on the far side. He pulled out his camera and began documenting the scene, working mechanically. The hole, the body, the claw marks, the torn jacket. Each photograph felt like evidence of something impossible. His radio crackled again. "Fisher, we have an update. A Polish tourist reported her daughter and friend missing this morning. 2 women, hiking trip. Does your victim match?" Wait. A pause. "The 7-year-old daughter is also missing." Martin's head snapped up. "A child? Confirmed. Authorities are organizing a search party. You're closest to last known position." A child. Martin's eyes swept the lake, the forest, the vast expanse of white. If the mother fell through the ice, where was the daughter? His mind raced through scenarios, ran for help and got lost, fell through elsewhere, hypothermia, animal attack. None of them ended well. Not in these temperatures, not after a full night exposed. "I'm starting search pattern now," Martin said. He looked down at the wolf tracks leading away from the lake. 2 sets going in, but only one coming back to his cabin. His pulse hammered in his ears. Where was the second wolf? Martin broke into a run, following the single set of tracks back into the forest. His equipment banged against his sides. His breath tore at his lungs. A child, 7 years old, out here all night in -15-degree weather. The survival window was already closed. He knew that, had known it, the moment dispatch said the words. But he ran anyway. The tracks led uphill, away from the lake, into dense forest where the snow was deeper. Martin crashed through it, no longer caring about stealth or protocol. Branches scraped his face, his legs burned. The wolf had gone this direction with purpose, not wandering, not hunting, going somewhere specific. And then he saw it, a snow cave, natural formation beneath a fallen spruce, the kind of shelter he'd taught survival students to build. And outside it, pressed into the snow, the clear impression of a large wolf's body. Martin's legs almost gave out. Martin dropped to his knees at the entrance of the snow cave, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Someone in there?" Silence. Then, barely audible, a whimper. He pulled his flashlight from his belt with shaking hands and aimed it into the darkness. The beam caught something, a flash of color that didn't belong in the wilderness. Pink. A child's jacket. "Oh God," Martin breathed. He lunged forward, crawling into the narrow space. "I'm here! You're safe! I'm here!" The girl was curled in the fetal position, wrapped in what looked like a silver emergency blanket. The mother's, Martin realized with a jolt. The woman had tried to save her daughter before going for help, before the ice took her. The child's face was pale, lips tinged blue, but her eyes were open. Alive, impossibly, miraculously alive. Martin's training kicked in. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse was there, thready but present. Her breathing was shallow. Hypothermia, definitely, but she was conscious. That was something. That was everything. "My name is Martin," he said softly, already pulling his thermal blanket from his pack. "I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy. Martin wrapped her in his blanket and grabbed his radio. "This is Fisher. I have the child. Repeat, I have the child. She's alive, northwest of Gletscher, approximately 500 meters from the lake. I need emergency medical now." The response was immediate, excited voices overlapping. Martin didn't hear most of it. His hands were already working, doing what he'd been trained to do, checking for frostbite, assessing her condition, preparing to move her. But his mind kept circling back to the wolf's body impression in the snow outside the cave. How long had the animal lain there? All night? Sharing its body heat with a child it had never seen before? Martin looked more carefully at the cave's interior. The floor was lined with spruce boughs, not naturally fallen, but deliberately placed. Insulation from the frozen ground. And pressed into one wall was another wolf-shaped depression, smaller than the first. Both wolves had been here. They'd found the child after the mother fell through the ice, and they'd done something that Martin's 40 years of wildlife management told him was impossible. They'd kept her alive. "The dogs were warm," the girl whispered suddenly in accented English. Her eyes found Martin's face. "The dogs stayed with me." Martin's throat closed completely. He couldn't speak for 5 seconds. 10. "Yes," he finally managed. "Yes, they did." The girl's small hand gripped his jacket. "Mama went to get help. She said to stay here. The dogs came. They were so warm." Her voice was dreamy, disconnected. Hypothermia, talking. But the memory was clear. Martin held her closer, his own body heat transferring through the layers of blankets. His mind was reeling. The wolves had found the child, alone, terrified, freezing, and instead of seeing prey, they'd seen something else, something that needed protection. They'd laid with her all night, sharing their warmth. And when dawn came and they understood she wouldn't survive another night, one wolf stayed while the other went for help. Went to the one human in these mountains who might understand. "Where did the dogs go?" the girl asked. Her eyes were closing again. Martin gently patted her cheek to keep her conscious. "They had to leave," he said. "But they made sure you were safe first." Through the cave entrance, Martin caught movement, a flash of grey against white. He turned his head slowly. There, 30 meters away at the tree line, stood a wolf. Large male. The same one that had scratched his door. It was watching them, completely still except for the fog of its breath in the cold air. Their eyes met. Martin didn't move, didn't reach for his rifle, just held the child and stared at the animal that had done something science said couldn't happen, the wolf that had understood a human child needed help, the wolf that had remembered a forester's cabin 6 kilometers away, the wolf that had tried everything in its power to save 2 lives. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then the wolf dipped its head once, a gesture so deliberate it couldn't be accidental, and melted back into the forest. Martin's vision blurred. He blinked hard, holding the warm weight of the living child in his arms. The helicopter blades cut the air with a sound like thunder. Martin held the child against his chest as the rescue team secured them both in the harness, and within seconds they were lifting off, the forest shrinking beneath them. The girl, her name was Zofia, he'd learned, was semi-conscious now, wrapped in heat packs and emergency blankets. The paramedic worked quickly, inserting an IV line, checking vitals, speaking into his radio in rapid German. Martin couldn't stop shaking, not from cold, but from something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the temperature. "She's stable," the paramedic shouted over the noise. "Core temperature is 89 degrees. Another few hours and we'd be having a different conversation." He looked at Martin with professional respect. "Good work getting to her when you did." Martin nodded but didn't speak. Good work. As if he'd done something heroic. As if he hadn't slept through the entire night while a wolf scratched itself bloody trying to wake him. While 2 animals had done what he was trained and paid to do. At the hospital in Innsbruck, Martin gave his statement to the police 3 separate times. Each time he included everything, the scratched door, the tracks, the claw marks on the ice, the evidence that the wolves had tried to pull the mother from the water. The evidence that they'd sheltered the daughter all night. The officer taking notes kept glancing up at him with poorly concealed skepticism. "You're saying wolves rescued the child," the officer said finally, his pen hovering over the page. "I'm saying wolves found her and kept her alive until I could get there," Martin corrected. His voice was flat, empty. "The evidence is at the scene. Document it however you want." The officer wrote something down, and Martin knew without looking that it would be dismissed. Wolves were predators. Dangerous. The official report would say the child survived due to the emergency blanket and the natural shelter of the snow cave. Animal involvement would be noted as inconclusive or coincidental. The scratches on his door would become a wolf-marking territory. The claw marks on the ice would be explained away as scavenging behavior after the woman died. No one would believe what actually happened. Martin returned to Gletscher 2 days later with the recovery team. They pulled the woman's body from the lake, Katarzyna Nowak, 32 years old, from Krakow, a mother who died trying to save her daughter. The team photographed everything, measured everything, documented the scene with clinical precision. No one mentioned the claw marks except to note them as animal activity post-mortem. Martin stood at the edge of the lake while they worked, his hands in his pockets, staring at the spot where he'd found her. The wolves had tried so hard. The grooves in the ice were still visible, deep enough that he could fit his fingers into them. They'd torn their pads open, they'd worked for hours. And when they failed, they didn't abandon the child. They protected her instead. Fisher. One of the team members called him over. "We found wolf tracks leading into the forest. Fresh ones. You want us to report them?" Martin looked at the young man, mid-20s, probably fresh from forestry school. "No," he said quietly. "Leave them alone." "But protocol." I said leave them alone." Martin's voice had an edge now that made the young man step back. "They're not a threat. Trust me on that." That night, Martin sat in his cabin with the repaired door and wrote a report that he knew would never be filed. He documented everything he'd seen, every detail of the wolves' behavior, every piece of evidence that pointed to something science couldn't yet explain. Deliberate rescue behavior, problem-solving, empathy, seeking human help as a last resort. He wrote it all down and then locked it in his desk drawer. At midnight, he heard scratching at his door. Martin's heart stopped. He rose slowly, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation this time. No rifle, no fear. Just him and the darkness and whatever was on the other side. The large male wolf stood 10 meters away. Even in the dim light from the cabin, Martin could see the blood-crusted pads on its front paws. The wolf watched him, and Martin watched back. "She's alive," Martin said, into the silence. "The child, Zofia, she's going to be okay." The wolf's ears twitched. Whether it understood the words or just the tone, Martin would never know. But something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, a recognition. Then the wolf turned and disappeared into the forest. 3 weeks passed. Zofia recovered in the hospital with remarkable speed. Children were resilient in ways that defied medical expectation. Martin visited her twice, bringing books and a stuffed wolf that made the nurses exchange uncomfortable glances. The girl's grandmother had flown in from Poland to take custody, a severe woman in her 70s who thanked Martin in broken German and wouldn't meet his eyes when he tried to talk about what had happened in the forest. "She says dogs," the grandmother told him. "I tell her no dogs. She dreams. The cold, it makes dreams." Her tone was final, closing the door on any other interpretation. But Zofia knew. When her grandmother left the room to speak with doctors, the girl grabbed Martin's sleeve. "The dogs were real," she whispered. "They had yellow eyes. One of them licked my face." Her small hand was surprisingly strong. "Tell them they were real." Martin's throat ached. "I know they were real," he said. "I saw them too." The girl's face transformed with relief so profound it made Martin's chest hurt. Someone believed her. That was enough. Back in the Ötztal sector, Martin's life should have returned to normal. He filed his reports, conducted his patrols, managed the winter wildlife population counts. But everything felt different now, as though someone had adjusted the lens through which he viewed the world, and he couldn't quite get it back to the original setting. He started finding things at his cabin door. A rabbit, freshly killed, placed carefully on his doorstep. 3 days later, the partial remains of a deer haunch. A week after that, an arrangement of feathers and bones that looked almost ceremonial. His colleagues, when he mentioned it, laughed and said he'd attracted a persistent fox or marten. But Martin knew the tracks. He'd memorized them that morning in February. The size, the gait, the distinctive wear pattern on the front left pad. The wolf was leaving offerings, payment perhaps, or gratitude, or something humans didn't have words for yet. He never saw the animal during daylight, but at night, sometimes he'd catch movement at the tree line, a shape that was too large to be a dog, too deliberate to be random, watching. Guardian or observer, Martin couldn't say, maybe both. His wife noticed the change in him. "You're different since that rescue," she said one evening over dinner. Her eyes were concerned, searching his face. "You hardly sleep. You stand at the window for hours. Martin, what happened out there?" How could he explain that he'd spent 34 years believing he understood the natural world, only to discover he'd been viewing it through the narrowest of keyholes? That everything he'd learned about animal behavior, the neat categories of instinct and conditioning and survival drive, had been shattered by 2 wolves making a choice that shouldn't have been possible. "I saw something," he said finally. "Something that changed how I think about everything." She waited for him to elaborate. When he didn't, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Whatever it was," she said, quietly, "it's eating you alive." She wasn't wrong. Martin had started dreaming about the wolf's eyes, that moment of connection outside the snow cave. He'd wake at 3 in the morning with his heart racing, consumed by questions that had no scientific answers. Why had the wolves helped? How had they known to seek him specifically? What level of consciousness, of reasoning, of moral understanding did it require to make those choices? The literature he found online was sparse and largely dismissed by mainstream zoology. Scattered anecdotes of unusual animal behavior, incidents that could always be explained away as anthropomorphization or coincidence or misinterpreted observation. Science, Martin was learning, had very rigid boundaries about what it would consider possible. But he'd seen the claw marks, he'd held the living child. He'd looked into the wolf's eyes and seen something looking back that recognized him. 1 month after the rescue, Martin received a letter from Poland. Inside was a crayon drawing from Zofia, a little girl surrounded by 2 large grey shapes with yellow eyes. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, "Thank you for believing me." Martin pinned it to his office wall, and when his supervisor asked what it was, he said, "A reminder." A reminder that the world was stranger and more wonderful than any of them had been trained to accept. Spring came to the Alps with the violence of Thor. Ice broke apart in the high valleys with sounds like gunshots. Streams became torrents overnight. The forest transformed from monochrome to a riot of green, and with the change of season came the wolf pups. Martin found the den by accident during a routine patrol in late April. He'd been tracking a reported sick deer when he stumbled across fresh digging in a sheltered ravine, the unmistakable entrance to a wolf den. Protocol demanded he mark the location and maintain distance. Dens were protected by law during whelping season. He should have noted the coordinates and moved on. Instead, he sat down on a fallen log 50 meters away and waited. An hour passed. 2. The sun climbed higher, warming his face. Martin didn't move. His radio remained clipped to his belt, silent. His wife would be wondering where he was. He'd promised to be home for lunch, but his feet stayed planted and his eyes stayed fixed on that dark opening in the earth. Movement. A female wolf emerged first, lean and wary, her teats visible from recent nursing. She scanned the clearing with the hypervigilance of new mothers everywhere, then looked directly at Martin. He stopped breathing. She didn't run, didn't growl or flatten her ears or show any of the defensive behaviors he'd documented hundreds of times in his career. She just watched him, assessing. And then, impossibly, she sat down. The male emerged next, larger, battle-scarred, with distinctive markings Martin recognized instantly. The same wolf from February. The same wolf that had scratched his door, bloody. The same wolf that had looked at him outside the snow cave with something that might have been gratitude. The male's front paws still showed signs of healing. The pads were pink and new, the fur growing back in patches. He'd injured himself on the ice trying to save a human he'd never met. And now here he was, watching Martin watch him, making no move to protect or threaten. A tiny grey shape tumbled out of the den entrance. Then another. And another. 5 pups in total, maybe 6 weeks old, all legs and oversized ears and puppy clumsiness. They play-fought in the clearing while their parents maintained their vigil. One of the bolder pups wandered toward Martin, curious and fearless in the way only young things can be. The mother made a soft sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine. The pup stopped, looked back at her, then continued forward. She didn't call again, just watched, allowing. The pup came within 3 meters of Martin before losing its nerve. It sat down heavily, tilting its head with comical confusion. Why was this large creature just sitting here? Why wasn't it running or attacking or doing any of the normal things prey animals did? Martin's eyes burned. He blinked hard, and a tear tracked down his weathered cheek before he could stop it. The adult male took 2 steps forward, just 2. But it closed the distance enough that Martin could see every detail, the amber eyes, the grizzled muzzle, the old scar above the right eye. The wolf held his gaze for a long moment, and Martin understood with sudden, perfect clarity what was being communicated. Trust. Tentative and fragile, but real. The wolf was showing him the den, showing him the pups. The most vulnerable thing in a wild animal's life, and he was allowing Martin to witness it. After everything, the rescue, the offerings, the midnight visits, this was the wolf's final gesture. An acknowledgement that Martin was different, that Martin was safe. "Thank you," Martin whispered. His voice cracked on the words. "For what you did for her. Thank you." The wolf's ears twitched. Then with a fluid movement that seemed almost ceremonial, he dipped his head in that same deliberate gesture Martin had seen before. The female did the same a moment later. Martin stood slowly, careful to make no sudden movements. He backed away step by step, keeping his eyes down in a gesture of respect. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he turned and walked away. Behind him he could hear the pups resuming their play, their small yips carrying through the spring air. He made it 200 meters before his legs gave out. Martin sat on the forest floor with his back against a pine tree, shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't control. 40 years? 40 years he'd walked these mountains believing he understood them. He'd tagged animals, tracked migration patterns, managed populations with clinical precision. He'd made decisions about which animals lived and which died based on spreadsheets and harvest quotas and ecological balance models. He'd thought of them as resources, as data points, as biological machines running on instinct and genetic programming. And he'd been wrong about everything. The crying came from somewhere deep, a place he'd locked away since he was young and learned that foresters didn't weep over the natural world. You documented it, managed it, controlled it, but you didn't let it touch you. You couldn't afford to, or the job would break you. Every winter die-off, every poaching incident, every animal that suffered would tear pieces from your soul until there was nothing left. So Martin had built walls, thick ones, professional distance, his supervisor called it, necessary detachment. Those walls were dust now. The wolves had made a choice, not once, but multiple times. They'd attempted to rescue a drowning woman despite every instinct telling them humans meant danger. When they failed, they'd protected her child, sheltered her, warmed her, kept her alive through a night that should have killed her. Then one wolf had run 6 kilometers to the only human it had ever observed, gambling everything on the hope that Martin would understand, would help. And after all that, after saving a human life, the wolves had come back. Not for food or territory or any biological imperative Martin had been trained to recognize. They'd come back to say thank you, to share their most precious secret, to extend trust to a species that had persecuted them for centuries. Martin pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands and opened his photos. He scrolled back to February, to the images he'd taken at the lake, the claw marks in the ice, the torn jacket, the evidence that everyone had dismissed as animal activity or coincidental behavior or anthropomorphic interpretation. He zoomed in on one particular photo, the grooves where the wolves had dug in, trying to pull Katarzyna from the water. The marks were deep, desperate. They'd torn themselves apart trying to save her. And when Martin showed these photos to wildlife biologists when he'd presented his carefully documented observations, they'd smiled indulgently and suggested he was letting emotion cloud his scientific judgment. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was seeing patterns that weren't there, ascribing human emotions to animals that didn't possess them. But he'd looked into that wolf's eyes, twice now, and he'd seen something looking back. Recording this story, Martin realized he was documenting something incredible that would never be believed. If you feel the same, if your heart is racing right now because you understand what this means, then you know why this matters. Real stories like this deserve to be heard. His radio crackled to life. Fisher, this is Base. Do you copy? Martin wiped his eyes roughly, cleared his throat. Copy. We've got a situation. Rancher in Sector 7 reporting livestock kills. 3 sheep in 2 nights. He's demanding action. Says he saw wolves on his property. Martin's blood went cold. Sector 7 bordered his current location. His mind immediately went to the den, to the 5 pups tumbling in the spring sunshine, to the parents who'd shown him trust. What kind of action? He asked, though he already knew. Removal permit. Boss wants you to assess the situation and make a recommendation. Your senior officer on site. Removal permit. The bureaucratic language for a death sentence. If Martin confirmed that a wolf pack was killing livestock, the rancher had legal grounds to shoot on site. The whole pack could be eliminated within a week. Adults and pups, no exceptions. Fisher, you there? I'm here, Martin said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant, hollow. I'll assess the situation." He ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand. This was the job. This was what he'd done for 34 years. You assessed the damage, you identified the animals responsible, you made the call. Livestock loss meant economic impact, and economic impact meant permits got issued. It was policy, it was protocol, it was his decision. Martin stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He could walk to the rancher's property right now. He could examine the kills, document the evidence, write up his report. He'd probably find wolf tracks. This was prime territory. He might even find evidence linking the kills to the very pack that had saved Zofia. The same wolves that had shown him something he'd spent his entire career being told didn't exist. Consciousness, choice, morality. His hand went to his belt where his tracking equipment hung. Next to it was his sidearm, standard issue for large predator encounters. He'd never fired it at a wolf, never had to. But if he filed that report, if he confirmed the kills, someone else would do the shooting. And the result would be the same. 5 pups who'd never have a chance to grow up. 2 parents who'd understood something profound about the value of life, even a human life, even a stranger's life, and acted on it despite every evolutionary warning telling them to run. Martin looked back toward where the den lay hidden in the ravine. His entire career, his reputation, his livelihood, all of it balanced against what he'd witnessed, against what he knew to be true, even if he could never prove it. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "This is Martin Fisher," he said when the line connected. "I need to speak with Director Hartman. Yes, it's urgent. I'll wait." 2 minutes passed. 3. Martin's heart hammered against his ribs. He was about to do something that could end his career, but his hands were steady now, clear. "Fisher!" Director Hartman's voice was clipped, impatient. "What's this about? I'm in a meeting." "The Sector 7 livestock kills," Martin said. "I'm recommending against a removal permit." Silence on the other end. "Then you haven't even assessed the site yet." "I know the pack. They're not the problem." Martin kept his voice level, professional, even as his pulse roared in his ears. "I'll find the actual culprit, probably a lone male or a different pack entirely. Give me 72 hours. The rancher is demanding immediate action. He's already contacted the media. If we don't respond, then we respond wrong and kill the animals that saved a child's life in February." The words came out harder than Martin intended. "Sir, these wolves have shown unusual behavior patterns that warrant protection, not elimination. I'm formally requesting endangered status consideration for this specific pack." Another long silence. Martin could hear voices in the background, the shuffle of papers. When Hartman spoke again, his tone had shifted. "Are you seriously asking me to grant special protection to wolves based on your personal feelings about a rescue incident that half the office thinks you embellished? I'm asking you to trust 40 years of field experience," Martin said quietly. "I know what I saw, and I know these animals. They're not livestock killers. Give me 3 days to prove it. If you're wrong, if there's another kill in the next 3 days, the rancher gets his permit and you get a formal reprimand. Understood?" "Understood." Martin ended the call and immediately started walking towards Sector 7. He had 72 hours to find the real culprit, and he'd just staked his entire reputation on wolves that most people believed were mindless predators. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of sleepless tracking, forensic examination of kill sites, and constant radio updates. Martin found his answer on day 2. A lone male wolf, old and injured, with a damaged jaw that made hunting wild prey nearly impossible. The animal had been pushed out of its territory by a younger pack and had turned to easy targets out of desperation. Martin tracked it to a cave 4 kilometers from the den where the family pack lived. The evidence was irrefutable. Different track. Patterns, different killing methods, different territory, entirely. He filed his report with detailed photographs and GPS coordinates. The lone wolf would be relocated, not killed. Martin made sure of that. Just moved to a sanctuary where it could live out its remaining years without threatening livestock or starving to death. The family pack was cleared. When Martin returned to the den site on the 4th day, exhausted and running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline, the wolves were gone. The entrance had been carefully covered, the pups moved to a new location. Standard behavior when a den site was discovered by humans, even friendly ones. The pack had vanished into the wilderness. Martin sat in the empty clearing where he'd watched the pups play just days before. He should have felt disappointed. Instead, he felt something else. Relief. Pride. A bone-deep satisfaction that they were safe. He pulled out a worn notebook and began to write. Not an official report, he'd already filed that. This was different, personal, a record of everything that had happened, every detail he'd observed, every moment of impossible connection. He wrote about the scratched door and the claw marks in the ice and the child wrapped in wolf warmth. He wrote about looking into amber eyes and seeing something that shouldn't exist, according to every wildlife biology textbook ever published. He wrote until his hand cramped and the sun began to set. That night, back at his cabin, Martin heard familiar scratching at his door. Soft this time, almost tentative. He opened it immediately, nothing there, but on his doorstep lay a single wolf hair, thick, grey, silver, unmistakably from the male, and next to it, pressed into the soft earth, a perfect paw print. Goodbye, or maybe thank you, or perhaps something humans didn't have words for yet. Martin knelt and placed his hand over the print. His palm nearly covered it. They'd trusted him with their most vulnerable secret, and he'd chosen to protect it. The debt was paid, the covenant honored. He stood there for a long time, hand pressed to the earth, while stars emerged overhead and the forest breathed around him. When he finally went inside, he locked the door gently, careful not to disturb the marks. In the morning, rain would wash them away. But Martin would remember. He would always remember. If you've also encountered wonder in the animal world, if your heart is full of something you can't quite name, write in the comments. Share your own experience with moments that changed how you see the natural world.